coming down!
Come and play with us.
Wendy, darling, light of my life. The Shining is a 1980 film directed by Stanley Kubrick, starring Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, and Danny Lloyd. This movie is an adaptation of Stephen King's 1977 novel of the same name. It follows the Torrance family that moves into this very isolated hotel where a sinister presence is influencing the father, Jack Torrance, into violence. And at the same time, his psychic son Danny is seeing horrifying forebodings from both the past and the future. When I saw The Shining for the very first time years ago, I thought it was painfully slow. But it gave me this very unsettling feeling that I've only really ever gotten when I've watched The Exorcist, and it's this feeling where I knew I was watching something that I hadn't really ever seen before. It seemed like an experience that was never going to happen again in cinema history. And what really didn't help me feeling like this movie was painfully slow the first time is that the movie's almost 2.5 hours long, and it does seem to take its time a lot, and it's not just a straight up jump scare fest. It's a slow burn for sure. But if you ask a few people about The Shining, they will all give you 100 different interpretations, analysis, or opinions on what this movie is to them. Upon its initial release, it was kind of misunderstood, but then over time, it's one of those movies that critics and audiences alike were like, oh my god, no, this is a classic in not only the horror genre, but in cinema in general. And obviously you have the masterful Stanley Kubrick helming. That's why this movie feels like a once-in-a-lifetime experience or once-in-a-lifetime career-defining movie. And he's had many career-defining movies, to be honest with you, but it went down in history as one of the best horror movies of all time. So, of course, I had to talk about it. Stephen King himself famously hates this movie, and this is why.
Jack Torrance is a difficult character, but he's fundamentally a sympathetic character. And I always visualized him as a piece of metal that's bent first one way and the other by these malignant spirits who basically want his son because his son is a psychically powerful person. So I saw these all as warm characters that were being threatened by forces from without, from ghosts, from real supernatural creatures. And the film is extremely cold. Stanley Kubrick saw The Haunting as coming from Jack Torrance, from the Jack Nicholson character, whereas I always saw it from outside. So we had a fundamental difference of opinion about it. I always thought that the real difference between my take on it and Stanley Kubrick's take on it was this. In my novel, the hotel burns. In Kubrick's movie, the hotel freezes.
Kubrick's version is very cold, while Stephen King in his version is very warm. And, well, in Stephen King's writing in general, he says he provides this warmth that his readers enjoy so much, and that's why they keep coming back, and he feels like that's what this movie was lacking. If you were to ask my personal opinion on why Stephen King does not like this movie, though, I think it's because Stephen King wrote Jack Torrance to be a mirror image of himself. Because when you think about it, Jack Torrance is this writer who is struggling with alcoholism and his own demons. At the same time, Stephen King was very well known for having to deal with his alcoholism and his drug abuse and a bunch of problems that he had. So Jack Torrance is him. And the way that Kubrick portrays Jack Torrance in this movie is very monstrous and cold, and he has this contemptuous feeling towards his family from the very beginning of the movie. And honestly, and Jack Nicholson doesn't really really help with this, I guess, but from the very beginning of this movie, you watch it and you're like, ain't no way this dude is not a psychopath. Like, he looks insane. Look at his face. So that's why I could kind of see why Stephen King would take this portrayal of his character personally. I personally think, though, that despite what Stephen King says about Jack Torrance, or the portrayal of his characters, or the atmosphere of this movie, I think Jack Nicholson gives an iconic performance. It's one of the most iconic in horror movie history. But to some, like Steven Spielberg, Jack Nicholson's performance comes across as very over the top.
I thought Jack Nicholson, who is a great actor, I thought it was a great performance. He said, "You mean you think Jack went over the top?" And I said, "Yeah, I kind of did." And he said, "Okay, who are your top favorite actors of all time?" And I want you to think, just name off some names. So I quickly, went Spencer Tracy, Henry Fonda, Jimmy Stewart, Cary Grant, Clark Gable. He stopped me. He said, "Okay, where was James Cagney on that list?" I thought, well, he's up there high. I said, but he's not in the top 5. He said, "You don't consider James Cagney one of the 5 best actors around." You see, I do. This is why Jack Nicholson's performance is a great one.
And while I think that Nicholson gives this very huge performance, I wouldn't necessarily say it's over the top. It's probably just not everyone's cup of tea. You could say the same thing about Shelley Duvall in this movie, who I also think gives a fantastic performance despite what a lot of people say. A lot of people like to hate on Shelley Duvall. I think she is wonderful in this movie, and Kubrick famously mistreated her a lot on set and apparently was rumored to be an asshole towards Duvall. It is rumored that he did this because he really wanted to bring out her performance. And while I don't agree with this tactic, it definitely worked. But back to Jack Nicholson's performance, his descent into madness in this movie is awesome because you can see the emphasis he is putting on his facial expressions, his gesticulation, his dialogue, the way he uses inflection in his voice. But you still can't try and convince me that this dude was not already crazy before going to the hotel. I mean, come on. A lot of people like to say that the performances in this movie feel off, but the whole movie is supposed to feel off. From the performances to the visuals to the music by Wendy Carlos, which is amazing, by the way. Speaking of that amazing score, though, it's very unique because it's not really comprised of any music per se. It's all sounds. It's all just creepy sounds put together to emphasize moments in the movie, and it's honestly what makes this whole movie work, because without it, it wouldn't be as creepy. It wouldn't have this unsettling feeling that we get by watching it. Some of the most iconic imagery in cinema history comes from this movie, whether it's the twins in the hallway and Danny Torrance is on his little tricycle just, going down the hallways, or all the blood coming out the elevator. And of course, you have the classic, "Here's Johnny."
Here's Johnny!
That axe scene has become one of the most iconic parts of the entire movie. But honestly, I think this movie already has so many iconic parts, it's really hard to pick. But obviously, when you think of this movie, you think of Here's Johnny. Kubrick, I believe, had subscribed to the maximalist filmmaking ideals as opposed to less is more. He believed that more is more, and a lot of filmmakers do. A lot of the best filmmakers of all time subscribe to that notion. And you could say that Christopher Nolan subscribes to that notion too, who he obviously has a lot of inspiration from Kubrick, but all of his movies feel so grand in scale and so epic, especially in their long run times, and they're just packed with so many allegories. The way this movie is shot too is very different than how horror movies at that time and even still today are filmed. This movie is very brightly lit with a lot of wide shots and a lot of long hallways, a lot of big rooms, and most horror movies are obviously in like a dark, creepy house that you can't really see anything. It's cobwebs everywhere and there's fog outside. Very cliche. This movie is like, how can we purposefully be as different as possible and make all the opposite choices that movies would usually make? This movie has really grown on me on subsequent watches, and it has become one of my favorite horror movies of all time. Easy. I don't know where I'd rank it. Definitely doesn't beat The Exorcist for me, to be honest with you, but it's up there for sure. I'm going to give the movie 4.5 out of 5 stars. Thank you guys again for watching, and I'll catch you in my next episode and my last episode of the 31 Days of Horror.